at 10:18 a.m. Coordinated Universal Time on Saturday, May 2nd, in a single statement posted to the website of the People's Republic of China Ministry of Commerce in Beijing, the government of Xi Jinping issued a 5-paragraph injunction that may prove to be the most consequential economic document of the entire decade. The order is titled blandly. It uses the dry administrative language of a customs notice. It refers to specific company names, specific treasury designations, specific paragraph numbers, and obscure regulatory filings. And buried inside that bureaucratic packaging is a sentence that detonates 70,000 United States sanctions in a single legal motion. What is about to be explained is not what the headlines are reporting. The headlines are calling this a trade dispute. The headlines are calling this a diplomatic escalation. The headlines are calling this a routine response to a routine sanctions package. None of that is accurate. What Beijing did on Saturday is the first time in the history of the post-1945 international financial order that a major power has formally ordered its own private sector to ignore the extraterritorial reach of the United States Treasury Department. Not contest, not negotiate, not retaliate, ignore. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce invoked what its own statement describes as a blocking order. The mechanism was created in 2021. It has been sitting on the books unused for nearly 5 years. It has never been activated against the United States. It has never been activated against anyone. It is a legal instrument of last resort, and Beijing just pulled it out of the drawer and placed it on the table. The immediate target appears narrow. 5 Chinese refineries have been named: Hengli Petrochemical of Dalian, Shandong Jincheng Petrochemical Group, Hebei Xinhai Chemical Group, Shouguang Luqing Petrochemical, and Shandong Shengxing Chemical. These are not state-owned giants. They are privately owned independent processors that the industry calls teapot refineries, small, regional, unglamorous facilities that account for roughly 25% of total Chinese refining capacity and operate on margins so thin that a $2 movement in crude oil pricing can determine quarterly survival. The United States Treasury Department sanctioned these refineries on April 24th. The justification was specific. According to the Treasury, Hengli Petrochemical alone generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for the Iranian military through its purchases of discounted Iranian crude. The sanctions froze assets in the United States financial system. They prohibited transactions with American counterparties. They placed the named entities on the specially designated nationals list, which is the most severe designation Washington can apply short of declaring an act of war. 8 days later, Beijing responded with a single sentence that strips those sanctions of their power inside Chinese jurisdiction. The Ministry of Commerce announcement states that the United States measures shall not be recognized, implemented, or complied with. That language matters. It is the language of legal nullification. It does not say that China disagrees with the sanctions. It says that within the borders of the People's Republic, the sanctions do not exist. The stakes here are difficult to overstate. The Strait of Hormuz, which has been operating in degraded capacity since the joint United States and Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28th of this year, handles approximately 20% of global seaborne oil and liquefied natural gas. Iranian oil exports before the strikes ran near 150,000 barrels per day. The vast majority of that flow, by some estimates more than 90%, moved to Chinese teapot refineries through a complex laundering network of ship-to-ship transfers, falsified bills of lading, and reflagging operations conducted in the waters off Malaysia and Singapore. When Washington sanctioned the refineries, Washington was not making a symbolic gesture. Washington was attempting to sever the financial artery that has kept the Iranian regime solvent through 8 months of military and economic siege. That artery has now been protected by the second largest economy on Earth, and the consequences begin within 72 hours. The mechanism Beijing invoked is technically called the Rules on Counteracting Unjustified Extraterritorial Application of Foreign Legislation and Other Measures. It was promulgated by the Ministry of Commerce on January 9, 2021, in direct response to the first Trump administration's sanctions campaign against Huawei. For 5 years, the rules existed as a deterrent threat. Activation would mean that any Chinese entity penalized by United States sanctions could file suit in Chinese courts for damages. Activation would mean that Chinese subsidiaries of American multinationals would face a binary choice between complying with United States law and complying with Chinese law. Activation would mean that the global compliance architecture built up over 4 decades of dollar system dominance would face its first genuine legal challenge. Beijing held the weapon in reserve through the Huawei dispute. Beijing held it through the trade war of 2018 and 2019. Beijing held it through the chip export controls of 2022. Beijing held it through the Taiwan Strait crisis of August 2022. Beijing held it through the balloon incident of February 2023. Beijing held it through every subsequent provocation, every subsequent designation, every subsequent escalation. Beijing did not hold it past May 2nd, 2026. The question of why now is the question that defines the entire strategic moment. The answer is contained in three converging pressures that Western analysts have systematically underweighted. The first pressure is energy. China imports approximately 11,400,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Of that volume, somewhere between 1,400,000 and 1,650,000 barrels per day flow from sanctioned sources, primarily Iran, secondarily Russia, with smaller volumes from Venezuela. Since the February 28th strikes and the subsequent partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Chinese onshore crude inventories have drawn down at a rate of approximately 480,000 barrels per day. At current consumption, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve provides roughly 90 days of import coverage. That window is closing. The second pressure is industrial. The teapot refineries that have been sanctioned account for processing capacity of roughly 2,800,000 barrels per day. They supply diesel, gasoline, and naphtha to the regional economies of Shandong, Hebei, and Liaoning provinces, three of the most industrially dense zones in the People's Republic. If the teapots are forced offline by United States banking pressure, the secondary effects on Chinese industrial output, employment, and provincial fiscal stability are not theoretical. They are calculable, and the calculation produces numbers that no Politburo member can accept. The third pressure is summit timing. President Trump and President Xi were tentatively scheduled to meet on May 3rd. The blocking order was issued on May 2nd. The sequence is not accidental. Beijing chose to walk into the summit holding a card that fundamentally alters the negotiating leverage on every other file: Taiwan, semiconductors, rare earths, the South China Sea, North Korea. By demonstrating willingness to nullify United States sanctions, Beijing has signaled that the entire architecture of American economic statecraft is now subject to Chinese veto. If you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Hit subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Turn on alerts, because what happens in the next 48 hours will rewrite the rules of the global financial system, and missing a single update means missing the moment that history shifts. The story is moving faster than any news cycle can track. The headline figure deserves explanation. The number 70,000 refers to the total volume of active United States sanctions designations administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the Bureau of Industry and Security, and the State Department's various sanctions authorities. The figure has grown from approximately 912 designations in 2000 to 9,400 designations in 2017 to over 70,000 active designations today. Iran alone accounts for more than 5,200 individual designations. Russia accounts for more than 6,300. China-linked entities prior to Saturday accounted for approximately 1,800. What Beijing's blocking order signals is not a challenge to one designation or 5 designations. It is a challenge to the legal premise on which all 70,000 designations rest, that the United States Treasury Department possesses the unilateral authority to determine which non-American entities may participate in the global dollar clearing system. For 4 decades, that premise has been accepted by every major economy, including economies that resented it deeply. France resented it through the Iran nuclear deal. Germany resented it through the Nord Stream sanctions. Japan resented it through the chip export controls. None of them broke the premise. All of them eventually complied. China just stopped complying. And the moment a major economy stops complying, every other reluctant economy is forced to recalculate. To understand why Hengli Petrochemical of Dalian sits at the center of this confrontation, the structure of the facility itself requires examination. The Hengli complex on Changxing Island in Liaoning province is one of the largest single-site refineries on Earth. It processes approximately 400,000 barrels of crude per day. It is integrated downstream into petrochemical production, including paraxylene, ethylene, and polyester precursors that feed into the global textile supply chain. It employs more than 30,000 workers directly and supports an estimated 200,000 jobs across the regional economy. When the United States Treasury designated Hengli on April 24th, the Treasury was not striking at a marginal player. The Treasury was striking at one of the most economically significant single industrial facilities in the People's Republic. The expectation in Washington appears to have been that Beijing would respond with the standard playbook: protest, denounce, file complaints at the World Trade Organization, perhaps impose minor symmetric sanctions on a comparably sized American firm. That playbook has been the standard for 15 years. Beijing did not run the playbook. Beijing nullified the designation. The injunction also names Shandong Jincheng Petrochemical Group, Hebei Xinhai Chemical Group, Shuguang Luqing Petrochemical, and Shandong Shengxing Chemical. These are smaller facilities ranging from 80,000 to 220,000 barrels per day of processing capacity each. Their combined importance is not in scale but in distribution. 3 are concentrated in Shandong province, which accounts for approximately 70% of Chinese teapot refining capacity. 1 is in Hebei, which surrounds Beijing itself. The geographic distribution signals that Beijing is willing to defend the entire teapot ecosystem, not selectively, not regionally, but comprehensively. There is a 6th refinery that does not appear in the injunction. Qingdao Haiyé Oil Terminal Company was sanctioned by the United States Treasury on Friday, May 1st, for importing tens of millions of barrels of Iranian crude. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce did not include Qingdao Haiyé in the May 2nd blocking order. That omission may indicate that the order was finalized before the Qingdao Haiyé designation was announced. It may also indicate that Beijing is reserving Qingdao Haiyé for a second-stage response, holding back ammunition for a follow-on escalation if Washington does not de-escalate. Either interpretation produces the same conclusion. This is not a one-off action. This is the opening move of a sustained campaign. For the Iranian regime, Saturday's announcement is the most significant external development since the February 28th strikes. The Islamic Republic's economic position has been deteriorating on a measurable timeline. Iranian oil revenue, which peaked at approximately $54 billion annually in 2022, has collapsed to a projected $11 billion for 2026. Iranian onshore crude storage capacity, which can hold approximately 76,000 barrels at full utilization, has been running near 91% of capacity since mid-March. At current production rates and constrained export volumes, Iranian storage is projected to reach physical maximum capacity within approximately 18 days, at which point well shut-ins become unavoidable, and well shut-ins in Iranian fields are not always reversible because the geological conditions of certain reservoirs produce permanent damage when production is interrupted. Beijing's blocking order does not solve the Iranian crisis. It does not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It does not move Iranian crude to Chinese refineries any faster than the existing degraded logistics network permits. What it does is preserve the buyer. As long as the teapots can continue purchasing without facing immediate cascading bank-level enforcement, Iranian oil retains a market. And as long as Iranian oil retains a market, the regime in Tehran retains the foreign currency reserves needed to pay the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, subsidize bread, and maintain the political coalition holding the country together. The United States sanctions strategy was designed to choke off that revenue at the buyer level, on the theory that Iranian production becomes worthless without buyers. Beijing has just informed Washington that the buyer level is no longer accessible. The United States now faces a decision with no clean options. Each available response carries strategic costs that compound against the others. The first option is escalation. Washington could expand the sanctions to include the major Chinese banks that finance the teapot refineries, institutions like Bank of Kunlun, certain regional branches of Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, and select foreign currency clearing operations of China Construction Bank. This is the financial equivalent of a kinetic strike. It would sever the named institutions from the dollar system and force every counterparty bank in the world to choose sides. It would also, almost certainly, trigger a Chinese counter-response that targets American banks operating in Asia, American technology firms dependent on Chinese suppliers, and the rare earth supply chains that feed United States defense manufacturing. The second option is negotiation. Washington could offer to roll back the April 24th designations in exchange for verifiable commitments from Beijing to reduce Iranian crude purchases on a defined timeline. This is the path of least immediate confrontation, but it represents a fundamental concession, the public acknowledgement that United States sanctions can be negotiated rather than enforced. Once that acknowledgement exists, every future sanctions target will demand the same negotiation. The third option is asymmetric pressure. Washington could leave the existing sanctions in place and target adjacent infrastructure, Chinese tankers, Chinese port operators, Chinese insurance providers, Chinese maritime services firms. This approach allows the original designations to stand while inflicting cumulative costs that pressure Beijing toward voluntary compliance. The risk is that the cumulative costs trigger exactly the cascade Washington is trying to avoid. The fourth option is military signaling. The United States could surge additional naval assets to the Western Pacific, accelerate Taiwan-related arms transfers, or conduct freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea on a more aggressive tempo. This converts the economic confrontation into a military signaling exercise. It carries the highest risk and the lowest direct relevance to the underlying sanctions question. There is no fifth option. The Treasury Department does not possess a tool that has not been considered. The Pentagon does not possess a tool that has not been wargamed. The State Department does not possess a relationship that has not been deployed. This is the moment when the unipolar sanctions architecture meets its structural limit. The closest historical parallel to Saturday's announcement is not a recent event. It is the Suez Crisis of 1956, when the United States used its position in the post-war financial system to force Britain and France to abandon their joint military operation against Egypt. The mechanism was a threat by the Eisenhower administration to liquidate American holdings of British government bonds, which would have collapsed the pound sterling. Britain folded within 72 hours. The episode is generally considered the moment when the United Kingdom ceased to be a global power, and the moment when the United States demonstrated that financial dominance could substitute for military force in producing strategic outcomes. What Beijing did on Saturday is the inverse of Suez. Beijing has demonstrated that a non-dollar economic bloc has now grown large enough to absorb the financial pressure that toppled British power in 1956. The mechanism is not symmetric. China is not yet capable of using financial leverage to force American policy reversals the way Eisenhower forced British policy reversals, but the demonstration effect is similar in magnitude. A pillar of the existing order has been shown to bend. A second parallel applies. In 1971, the Nixon administration severed the dollar from gold convertibility, ending the Bretton Woods system. The decision was made unilaterally without consultation with allies. The shock to the international monetary system was absorbed because no alternative reserve currency existed at sufficient scale. The result was a transition period of approximately a decade before the dollar-based system stabilized into its modern form. The current moment may represent the inverse transition. There is no single alternative to the dollar today, but there is now a demonstrated willingness to operate outside the dollar system when costs justify it. A subsidiary development deserves attention. Settlement of the disputed Iran-China oil trade has been moving toward yuan-denominated transactions on an accelerating timeline. In 2022, approximately 12% of Chinese imports from sanctioned sources settled in yuan. In 2024, the figure rose to approximately 27%. By the first quarter of 2026, the figure had reached an estimated 41%, and the May 2nd blocking order is likely to drive the figure above 60% within 90 days. The yuan is not a global reserve currency. It is not freely convertible. It is subject to capital controls that make it unattractive as a store of value for non-Chinese counterparties. None of that matters for the specific application of pricing oil trades that Washington has placed outside the dollar system. The yuan does not need to replace the dollar globally. It needs only to function as a medium of exchange for the specific transactions Washington has prohibited. And for that narrower function, the yuan is now adequate. What is being explained right now is not theoretical. It is happening. If notifications are not yet enabled, this is the moment. The next update on this story will arrive within hours, and it will determine the trajectory of the entire confrontation. Subscribe, hit the bell, stay informed. Moscow has watched Saturday's announcement with calculated interest. Russia has been operating outside the dollar system for sanctioned trade since 2022. The mechanisms Russia developed, the system for transfer of financial messages, the bilateral settlement arrangements with India and Turkey, the gold-backed payment channels with select African and Latin American counterparties represent the operational template that Beijing is now positioned to scale. Russian crude exports to China, currently run at approximately 2,300,000 barrels per day, settled almost entirely outside dollar channels. The infrastructure exists. The blocking order is the policy declaration that the infrastructure will now be defended at the state level. For Moscow, this is the strategic outcome of 3 years of patient erosion. Russia did not need to defeat the dollar system. Russia needed only to demonstrate that operation outside the dollar system was survivable long enough for a larger partner to join the parallel architecture. China has now joined. The European Union faces a problem that Brussels has been quietly fearing since the first Trump administration. European companies operate within the dollar system. European banks clear in dollars. European energy purchases from non-sanctioned sources settle in dollars. If the United States and China enter a sustained sanctions confrontation, European firms will be forced to choose between the world's largest consumer market on one side and the world's largest manufacturing base on the other. The choice is not abstract. It is operational. Volkswagen sells more cars in China than in Europe. Airbus has more orders from Chinese carriers than from American carriers. ASML's most advanced lithography systems have customers on both sides of the divide. European officials have been silent on Saturday's announcement for the first 36 hours. The silence is itself a signal. Brussels is not going to publicly defend American sanctions enforcement against the second largest economy on Earth. Brussels may not publicly oppose American sanctions enforcement either. The most likely outcome is a posture of strategic ambiguity that allows European firms to continue trading with the named refineries through carefully structured intermediaries, while European governments avoid taking a formal position. This is not what Washington needs. Washington needs European cooperation in enforcement. Without that cooperation, the sanctions become a North American policy rather than a Western policy, and a North American policy applied against the second largest economy on Earth produces negotiated outcomes rather than imposed outcomes. The next 72 hours will determine the shape of the international financial system for the next decade, not the shape of the United States-China relationship, not the shape of the Iranian crisis, the shape of the global system itself. 3 scenarios are now in play, and the trajectory of each depends on decisions being made tonight in Washington, Beijing, Tehran, and Tel Aviv. The first scenario is de-escalation. Under this path, the planned Trump-Xi summit produces a face-saving formula in which Washington narrows the original sanctions designations. Beijing quietly reduces but does not eliminate teapot purchases of Iranian crude, and the blocking order is allowed to remain on the books without being expanded. This outcome preserves the appearance of American sanctions authority while acknowledging the operational reality that the authority no longer extends fully into Chinese jurisdiction. Iranian oil flow continues at reduced volume. Oil prices stabilize in the $84 to $89 range. The summit is declared a success. The structural shift is real but disguised. The second scenario is controlled escalation. Under this path, Washington responds to the blocking order by sanctioning a second tier of Chinese entities, possibly mid-sized banks, possibly tanker operators, possibly insurance providers. Beijing responds by expanding the blocking order to cover the new designations. The cycle repeats 2 or 3 times before both sides find a new equilibrium at higher tension. Oil prices rise toward $96 to $104. American technology firms with Chinese supply exposure see significant share price compression. The Iranian regime survives the immediate revenue crisis, but at deeply degraded operating capacity. The third scenario is uncontrolled escalation. Under this path, Washington concludes that the sanctions architecture cannot be allowed to fail and responds with measures that target the major Chinese banks directly. Beijing responds with measures that target the dollar-clearing access of American firms operating in Asia. Within 10 to 14 days, the global financial system enters a period of acute dislocation. Oil moves above $120. Equity markets enter correction territory. Central banks coordinate emergency liquidity operations. The Iranian crisis becomes the secondary story. The primary story becomes the partial fragmentation of the post-1945 economic order. Which scenario materializes is genuinely uncertain. The variables include the personal chemistry of the Trump-Xi meeting if it occurs, the willingness of European governments to remain on the sidelines, the operational decisions being made inside the Iranian Supreme National Security Council, and the position taken by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates regarding production increases that could partially offset Iranian volume losses. What is not uncertain is that Saturday's announcement was the moment the rules changed. Before May 2nd, 2026, the question of whether American sanctions could be defied was theoretical. After May 2nd, 2026, the question is empirical, and the empirical answer is yes. The deadline is now. The clock is running. Iranian storage hits maximum capacity within 18 days. Chinese onshore crude inventories continue drawing down at 480,000 barrels per day. The Trump-Xi summit window closes within 48 hours, after which any face-saving formula becomes substantially harder to negotiate. Every hour that passes without de-escalation locks in a higher escalation baseline. 3 questions remain unresolved. Does Washington possess the political will to enforce sanctions against the second-largest economy on Earth, knowing that enforcement may break the system the sanctions are designed to defend? Does Beijing possess the operational capacity to sustain the blocking order if Washington responds with measures that target Chinese banks rather than Chinese refineries? Does Tehran possess the strategic patience to wait out the confrontation, or will the regime gamble on a provocation in the Persian Gulf designed to drag both Washington and Beijing into deeper commitment? None of these questions can be answered yet. All of them will be answered within weeks. The story is not over. The story is barely beginning. What happens next will determine whether the international order that emerged from the rubble of 1945 survives in recognizable form, or whether the next decade is remembered as the period when that order was quietly replaced by something the West has not yet named and does not yet understand. The next 48 hours are critical. The decisions being made right now in conference rooms in Washington and in Beijing will shape the trajectory of every subsequent confrontation between these two powers. There is no precedent for the moment that has just occurred. There is only the moment itself and the cascade of consequences now beginning to unfold. Stay close to this story. The updates will not slow down. The next development is already in motion.